This house once existed. It appeared on official maps, county surveys, and census records like any other American home. Then, without fire, demolition, or public record, it disappeared. The road remained, the land stayed intact, but the house was erased, first from paper, then from memory. No permits explain its removal. No documents record where the family went. Their names appear once in history and never again. Decades later, evidence beneath the soil suggested the house had not simply been lost, but deliberately removed. This is the story of a place America decided should never be found. In the early 20th century, America was carefully documenting itself, counting people, measuring land, and drawing maps meant to last forever. Every road, every property, every home was recorded with precision. That's what makes this story unsettling, because one house followed all the rules of history, until it didn't. It appeared where it was supposed to, tied to a family, a parcel of land, and a quiet stretch of road. Then, in a span of just a few years, it vanished from every official record. Not burned, not condemned, not replaced. The house was removed as if it had never existed at all. The family associated with it did not resettle elsewhere. They did not leave behind deaths, marriages, or paper trails. What remains is an absence, one so complete it raises a disturbing question. How does an entire home disappear in a country built on records? And more importantly, who decided it should? Before it became an absence, the house was simply a place. It stood along a narrow stretch of County Road 117, where the pavement thinned and the trees pressed closer together, as if the forest were slowly reclaiming the land. The house was modest, even by early 20th century standards. Wooden siding painted white, a shallow porch supported by 2 square posts, and a roof that sloped unevenly with age. Nothing about it suggested importance. That was its greatest disguise. The land around it was practical, not picturesque. A small clearing had been cut from the woods, just wide enough for the house, a vegetable patch, and a dirt path leading to the road. Survey maps from the era show the property outlined cleanly, its boundaries measured with confidence. To the county, it was one parcel among many. To passing travelers, it was barely noticed. And yet, the house was real. Sunlight reached it only in fragments, filtered through branches that cast long shadows across the porch. In the mornings, smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady, visible just above the tree line. At night, a single oil lamp glowed behind the front windows. These were the small signs of life that never make it into official records, but they mattered. They meant someone was there. Neighbors remembered it as quiet. No music, no gatherings. The family kept to themselves, neither unfriendly nor welcoming. Children were rarely seen beyond the edge of the property. When they were, they stayed close to the porch, as if the boundary of the land was also a boundary they were taught not to cross. County records listed the house without comment. No complaints, no disputes, no unusual notes in the margins. The structure met code, the land was taxed, everything about the place suggested normalcy. That normalcy would later become the most unsettling detail of all. Because places that disappear usually leave scars. A burned house leaves ash, a demolished one leaves rubble. Even abandonment leaves decay. Rotting boards, collapsed roofs, the slow violence of time. But when investigators would later stand on this land, they found none of that. The ground was unnaturally level, the soil compacted, as if something had been pressed down and sealed away. Early plats show the house drawn in simple lines, consistent with others nearby. No symbols marked it as temporary, no annotations hinted at future removal. The house was not an afterthought, it was part of the landscape. And then, without warning, it ceased to be. Later maps showed the road unchanged, the surrounding parcels intact, but the space where the house once stood was rendered empty, a blank rectangle where ink had once been. Not scratched out, not replaced, simply gone. The place remained, the house did not. This chapter of the story begins here, not with a crime or a disappearance, but with something far more unsettling. A place that existed long enough to be documented, taxed, and inhabited, and then was treated as though it never belonged to the world at all. If the house had vanished in isolation, it might have been dismissed as an error of memory. Buildings collapse, roads shift, time erases things quietly. But the records told a different story, one that suggested intention rather than neglect. In the early 1900s, American record-keeping had entered an age of obsession. Census enumerators moved door to door with clipboards and ledgers. County clerks cataloged deeds in heavy bound books. Surveyors etched property lines into maps meant to guide generations. Paper was authority. If something existed, it was written down. And the house was written down. In the 1904 county plat, the structure appears clearly, its footprint aligned with the road, its parcel numbered and taxed. The map is clean, methodical, confident. Nothing about it suggests uncertainty. The house belongs there. The census from the same period confirms it. An address is listed, 4 names are recorded. Ages, occupations, relationships, each line filled with care. This was not a marginal note or a questionable entry. It was official. 8 years later, the certainty ends. The 1912 revision of the county map still shows County Road 117 in the same position. Neighboring houses remain labeled, property lines are untouched, but where the house once stood, there is nothing. No notation, no explanation. The space is left deliberately blank, as if it were always meant to be empty. More unsettling is what does not appear alongside that change. There is no record of sale or transfer, no condemnation order, no fire report, no tax delinquency notice. The parcel does not change hands, it simply stops acknowledging that a structure ever occupied it. The census follows the same pattern. The address disappears entirely. It is not reassigned, it is not renumbered, it is removed. The 4 names listed years earlier do not resurface elsewhere. They do not appear as residents in neighboring counties. They do not reemerge in marriage registries, death certificates, or employment rolls. For record keepers trained to track people across decades, this absence is impossible to ignore. Clerks occasionally made mistakes, pages lost, ink faded, but entire households did not evaporate from every system at once. Disappearances left traces, misspellings, crossed-out lines, marginal notes. Here, there was nothing. The paper remained pristine. Even more troubling were the corrections that did exist. In some ledgers, faint impressions showed where entries had once been written and later removed, not erased through wear, but deliberately lifted, as if someone had taken care not to damage the page. Someone had returned to the records, not to add information, but to subtract it. By the time modern researchers examined these documents, the damage was already complete. The house existed long enough to be counted, taxed, and mapped. Then, through a quiet sequence of adjustments, it was untethered from history. The records did not forget the house. They were taught to deny it ever stood there at all. The family exists in the records only briefly, like a shadow caught between 2 passing lights. They appear in a single census return, neatly listed beneath the address of the house on County Road 117. A man recorded as the head of household, a woman listed as his wife. 2 children, Their age is close enough to suggest they were born into the same quiet rhythm of the place. There are no remarks beside their names, no annotations, nothing to distinguish them from thousands of other American families counted that year. And then, they are gone. In the next census, their names do not appear anywhere, not in the same county, not in neighboring towns, not under altered spellings or approximations. Enumerators were trained to track families that moved, to note changes in residence, to follow people across districts. This family leaves no such trail. They do not move forward in the records. They simply stop. There are no death certificates filed under their names, no burial entries in church logs, no probate records dividing property or possessions. The children never grow up on paper. They never marry. They never die. History offers them no future at all. Researchers attempted to reconstruct their lives through indirect means. Tax rolls showed the property assessed once and never again. School enrollment logs contained gaps where the children should have appeared. Even draft registrations, which later captured men long removed from their homes, offered nothing. It was as if the family had been carefully excised from every system that might remember them. What little survived came not from paper, but from memory. Decades later, when locals were asked about the house, their responses were hesitant and inconsistent. Some remembered a man who kept his head down. Others recalled a woman rarely seen beyond the porch. A few spoke of children who watched the road but never crossed it. None could agree on how long the family lived there. No one could say when they left. When asked why they left, conversations ended. Silence settled in those moments, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of something long agreed not to be discussed. People looked away, voices lowered. The past closed itself off. The absence of rumor was as telling as the absence of records. Communities often invent stories to explain tragedy. Here, there were none. No scandal, no crime whispered about at night. Just an unspoken understanding that the family no longer existed in any way that could be safely recalled. Whatever happened to them did not end with their disappearance. It reshaped the behavior of those who remained. A family does not vanish completely without consequence. Names are usually all that survive. Here, even the names were unstable, appearing once and then dissolving into nothing. By the time the house was removed from the map, the family had already been erased from memory. The structure was simply the last thing to follow them into silence. For more than half a century, the land where the house once stood remained undisturbed. No new construction, no sale announcements, no reason on paper to return to a place that officially had never held anything at all. Grass grew, trees thickened. The blank space on the map became easier to accept than to question. The discovery came by accident. In the late 1970s, a routine county reassessment required surveyors to remeasure several rural parcels along County Road 117. New equipment was used, tools capable of detecting variations beneath the surface that older methods could not. The land appeared ordinary until the readings began to drift. Lines curved where they should not. Measurements repeated inconsistently. Something was under the soil. At first, officials assumed a natural formation or remnants of farm activity. But when ground-penetrating scans were expanded, the shapes became unmistakable. Straight edges, right angles, a rectangular outline pressed into the earth. Not debris scattered by time, but a structure placed there deliberately. Excavation was authorized, quietly. Just beneath the surface lay a foundation, intact enough to trace the outline of a modest house. The soil above it had been compacted carefully, layered in a way that suggested closure rather than collapse. There was no burn layer, no blast pattern, nothing violent. This was not destruction. It was removal. Objects surfaced next. Fragments of ceramic plates, broken cleanly rather than shattered. Rusted nails pulled straight from wood. A corroded hinge. Then, near what would have been the front steps, the sole of a child's shoe, worn thin at the heel, too small to belong to an adult, too personal to be dismissed. No remains were found, no personal documents, no valuables. What remained were the things people leave behind only when they believe they are coming back, or when someone else decides what gets taken. The findings raised immediate questions. If a house had been dismantled, where were the materials? Lumber, metal, fixtures, none were accounted for in resale logs or salvage records. If it had been buried, why take such care to erase the evidence above ground? Officials moved quickly to minimize the implications. The site was labeled an unregistered structure. The artifacts were cataloged and stored. The foundation was reburied. No press release followed. No public report was issued. But the land no longer felt empty. Those involved in the survey later described an unease they couldn't name, the sense that the ground had been sealed, not abandoned, that the absence of remains was itself a statement. The house had not been lost. It had been closed. And whatever required that level of erasure was something the ground was never meant to reveal. Once the discovery was reburied, the official explanation arrived quickly and quietly. The foundation, according to county notes, belonged to an unregistered structure of no historical significance. The artifacts were classified as miscellaneous debris. The land was restored to its previous condition. The case was closed before it was ever opened. But closing a case does not erase its contradictions. Internal memos from the reassessment period show a sudden shift in language. Early drafts referred to a previous residence. Later versions replaced the term with possible outbuilding. Measurements were rounded. Descriptions softened. Precision gave way to ambiguity. It was not sloppy work, it was careful revision. Requests for further excavation were denied without explanation. Photographs taken during the dig were archived, but never indexed publicly. When inquiries were made about the family listed in the early census, clerks responded with the same phrase again and again: no relevant records found. Local officials insisted the maps had always been correct. And yet, earlier versions still existed. Privately held atlases, church plats, and insurance maps from the period showed the house clearly. In some cases, the image of the structure had been scratched out by hand, leaving faint impressions in the paper. In others, the ink remained untouched, but the pages had been removed entirely from bound volumes. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure consistency. What was most telling was not the presence of false information, but the absence of curiosity. No attempt was made to identify the family. No effort to reconcile conflicting documents. No investigation into why a taxed inhabited house had been dismantled without record. Silence became the solution. Residents who remembered the house noticed the renewed attention and withdrew. Doors closed. Conversations shortened. One former neighbor, when pressed, said only, "That place was handled," before refusing to speak further. Handled by whom was never clarified. The erasure extended beyond paper. Aerial photographs from mid-century show the land blurred slightly compared to surrounding parcels, as if the image had been altered. Later prints corrected the distortion, but the anomaly remained in archived copies. This was not a single act of removal, it was a process. Decisions made across decades, by different hands, all aligned toward the same outcome: the elimination of a place and the people tied to it. No signatures were left, no orders were preserved. Accountability dissolved into bureaucracy. By the time researchers attempted to reopen the matter, the system responded exactly as it had been designed to. with nothing to find. The house was gone, the family was gone, and the cover-up had become part of the landscape so complete it no longer looked like one at all. By the time investigators reached what they believed was the truth, it no longer looked like a revelation. There was no single document to uncover, no confession hidden in a forgotten drawer. What remained was a pattern, one that only became visible when absence itself was treated as evidence. The house had existed. That much was undeniable. It appeared in early maps, tax rolls, and a census. It had a foundation. It left behind objects shaped by daily life. These facts did not contradict one another. What contradicted them was everything that came after. Families disappear for many reasons: fires, floods, migration, even crime. But those events generate paperwork. They leave trails that bend but do not break. Here, the trail did not bend. It stopped. The careful dismantling of the house suggested control. Lumber removed cleanly, fixtures taken, the site leveled and sealed. This was not the work of panic or disaster. It was methodical, deliberate, and patient. Whoever did it expected scrutiny and planned for it. The absence of bodies was not reassurance, it was strategy. Without remains, there could be no crime scene. Without a crime scene, there could be no investigation. Without an investigation, there would be no story to tell. Records were not lost, they were edited. Not all at once, but in stages. A map corrected here, a ledger adjusted there. Each change small enough to escape attention, but together forming a complete erasure. No single person could be blamed because no single act explained it. The truth, then, was not about what happened on one night or in one moment. It was about what happened afterward, how an event was absorbed into the machinery of normal life and quietly neutralized. The family did not simply vanish, they were removed from systems designed to remember them. And the house was not destroyed because it was unsafe or unwanted. It was destroyed because it was proof. As long as it stood, it contradicted the story that followed. In the end, the truth was not hidden beneath the ground. It was hidden in plain sight, inside blank spaces, missing lines, and the shared decision not to ask why. This was not a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a conclusion waiting to be accepted. Long after the house was removed from the map, its absence continued to shape the land around it. The parcel was never developed. While neighboring properties changed hands, were subdivided or rebuilt, this stretch remained untouched. No new deeds were filed, no zoning requests submitted. It sat in quiet contradiction to the growth surrounding it, as if progress itself had learned to move around it rather than through it. Those who encountered the site in later years described an unease they struggled to explain. Not fear, something subtler. A sense that the ground was holding on to a memory it had been instructed not to release. Surveyors reported irregular readings. Builders declined contracts without clear reasons. Even animals seemed to avoid settling there for long. Officially, nothing justified the hesitation. Requests for historical clarification were met with finality. Records were declared complete. The matter was closed. The language was always the same: neutral, procedural, impossible to argue with. There was no appeal process for something that was said to have never existed. Researchers who continued independently found themselves working in fragments, copies of copies, marginal notes without context, oral histories that contradicted one another in detail but aligned in tone. Everyone agreed on one thing: the house was not to be discussed. Time did what it always does. It blurred faces, softened memories, thinned the number of people who could even remember the place at all. The road was repaved, the trees grew taller, the blank space on the map became permanent. And yet, the absence never fully settled, because erasure leaves behind pressure. a subtle distortion in the historical record that can be felt even when it cannot be proven. The house no longer existed, but the effort required to remove it still echoed in every missing line. The aftermath was not chaos or revelation, it was quiet success. The system worked. The story ended where it was supposed to. Nothing was found, nothing was questioned, nothing was corrected. And in that silence, the house completed its transformation from a place where people once lived into a gap history learned to live with. The house is gone now in every way that can be measured. It does not appear on maps, in ledgers, or in official memory. There is no address to visit, no marker to read, no name preserved in public record. If you stand on the land today, there is nothing to tell you that a family once lived there at all. And yet, the absence feels intentional. History is often described as what survives, but just as much of it is defined by what is removed. In this case, the removal was precise. A house dismantled without trace, a family erased without explanation, records adjusted until silence looked like accuracy. This was not neglect, it was maintenance. The most unsettling part is not that the truth was hidden, but that it didn't need to be buried deeply. It was spread thin across offices, decades, and small decisions made by people who understood that forgetting can be engineered. No single act erased the house, many small ones did. What happened inside that home may never be known, but what happened after is clear. The systems meant to preserve memory were used to delete it, and they succeeded. The land remains, empty by design, a reminder that some American nightmares are not marked by violence or spectacle, but by order, paperwork, and quiet agreement. Because the most effective erasures don't leave ruins. They leave nothing at all.